Sally Field is remembered as one of the greatest actresses in American film history, a woman defined by 2 Academy Awards, unforgettable performances, and a legacy built on authenticity, compassion, and emotional truth. From the gentle resilience of Norma Ray to the heartfelt wisdom of the mother in Forest Gump, she gave the world characters that felt real, human, and deeply understood. But at 79, her life reveals something far more profound. This is not just a story of fame, but of survival, of a childhood marked by silence, of wounds carried quietly through decades, and of a strength the world admired without ever truly understanding. Because that strength was never simply talent, it was something forged in darkness, built over years of struggle no one could hear, a resilience shaped long before the world ever learned her name. Now, we look beyond the surface, into a life shaped by triumph and loss, to understand how her later years became some of the most revealing and the most heartbreaking. Because the most haunting chapters of Sally Field's life were never lived under Hollywood lights, but in the quiet corners of a house in Pasadena, where silence was never peace, but something far more terrifying. What looked like a picture of stability from the outside was, in truth, a carefully disguised illusion. The California home seemed almost ideal. Sunlight spilling through open windows, a mother with a recognizable face from the screen, and a stepfather whose presence carried the weight of authority and admiration. To anyone observing from a distance, it resembles the kind of childhood that later gets rewritten into a perfect origin story. The narrative practically writes itself. A girl from Pasadena, raised in proximity to Hollywood, destined for greatness. But inside those walls, the reality unfolded along a far more fragile and unsettling line. Margaret Field, Sally's mother, possessed both beauty and a quiet vulnerability shaped by an industry that often gave as much as it took. She navigated life with grace, yet that grace exists within a constant uncertainty. A household where safety was never something guaranteed, only something hoped for. When she married Jock Mahoney, it seemed, at least outwardly, like the arrival of stability. He was imposing, disciplined, and admired. A former Marine, a respected stuntman, even a man who would embody Tarzan on screen. Everything about him fits the image of protection, of strength, of the figure a child is taught to trust without question. But for Sally Field, that image fractured almost as soon as it formed. He entered her life when she was just 4 years old, and what followed would stretch across an entire decade. 10 years that would quietly reshape the foundation of her childhood. Behind doors that appear, from every external corner, to conceal safety and order, something far more damaging took root. It was not a single moment, but a prolonged reality, one that would not fully surface until many years later, when she found the strength to put it into words with a clarity that refused both exaggeration and comfort. As a child, she did not yet have the language to define what was happening. Few children ever do. What remains instead is something deeper and more lasting. The body's memory, the instinct to brace without knowing why, the slow erosion of trust, the quiet realization that safety is not something you can assume, that the very people meant to protect you may also be the source of harm, that love and danger can exist side by side, wearing the same face, speaking in the same voice. And the most lasting result is not confined to those early years. It does not fade with time or distance. It evolves, embedding itself into the way a person understands their own worth, into the patterns they unconsciously repeat, into the persistent need for reassurance that no amount of recognition can fully satisfy. What begins in silence does not remain there. It travels forward, shaping a life in ways that even success cannot erase. There is a deeper fracture beneath the surface of what she endured, one that did not fully reveal itself until decades later, when time had stripped away every excuse and silence could no longer be justified. Sally Field would not confront it completely until she was in her 70s, after her mother had passed, when the truth no longer had to compete with fear, loyalty, or the fragile balance of a family held together by denial. Because the most devastating realization was not just what had happened, but what had been known. Margaret Field did not discover it too late, nor did she entirely fail to see. In the final stretch of her life, she acknowledged something far more painful: that she had been aware. Not in fragments, not in vague suspicion, but in a way that demanded a choice. And she chose to remain. She chose silence. In a world that offered women like her limited agency and even fewer options, she made a decision shaped by fear, dependence, and a complicated form of love, but a decision nonetheless. She preserved the structure of the home, even as something within it was quietly breaking beyond repair. There is no simple language for that kind of truth. No clean way to process what it means, as an adult, to understand that the one person meant to protect you saw the damage unfolding and did not intervene. It does not erase the love that existed between mother and daughter, nor does it flatten the complexity of that relationship. Sally carried that bond her entire life, layered, conflicted, deeply human. It became one of the emotional pillars of her memoir, not because it was easy to explain, but because it was impossible to ignore. Yet the weight of that knowledge settled into everything. It lived inside her work, inside her relationships, inside the warmth she offered the world so effortlessly. What audiences perceived as natural compassion was, in truth, something far more deliberate. It was built, moment by moment, choice by choice, a conscious act of becoming the safety she had never been given. Because here is what Sally Field did with the ruins of her early childhood. She built to herself anyway. Not perfectly, not without cost, not in any way that a therapist would describe as clean or linear or resolved. But she built it with the particular ferocity of someone who has been told by circumstances, not by words, that she does not deserve to take up space, and who decides, says somewhere in the marrow, to take it up anyway. She discovered acting as a teenager, and acting gave her something the house had never provided: a container for emotion that was otherwise unspeakable, a stage where the chaos inside could be shaped into something that other people could recognize and receive. When she performed, the feeling was not escape exactly. It was more like translation. She was finding a language for experiences that had no other available form. She studied. She worked. She pursued the craft with an intensity that her instructors noticed and her peers sometimes found unnerving. This was not a woman gliding towards stardom on charm and circumstance. This was a woman building a structure that could hold her weight, because she had learned very early that nothing else would. Her first significant television role arrived in 1965 with Gidget, a cheerful, sun-drenched comedy about a teenage surfer girl, as far from the interior landscape of Sally's actual experience as it is possible to imagine. She played the role with genuine brightness, with a fizzing comedic energy that delighted audiences and established her in the industry's collective imagination as exactly the kind of wholesome, accessible, relatable young woman that 1960s American television was designed to produce. The Flying Nun followed. More brightness, more accessibility, more of the particular kind of warmth that cameras love and industries exploit without ever asking what fuels it. And beneath all of it, the laugh, the lightness, and the girl next door that everyone felt they knew was a young woman who had never been protected by anyone, learning to protect herself through the only tool she had fully mastered, becoming whoever the room needed her to be. Adulthood arrived before understanding ever had the chance to take root. At just 21, Sally Field stepped into marriage in 1968 with Stephen Craig. Not only young in age, but young in the deeper sense of someone still carrying unexamined wounds into a life that required stability. 2 sons, Peter and Eli, soon followed, and with them came the quiet weight of responsibility layered over an identity still in formation. Like many early marriages, it bore the strain of expectation and growth, but in her case, those pressures were intensified by an industry that demanded performance not just on screen, but in life itself, offering little space for a woman to evolve before expecting her to appear complete. By 1973, the marriage had come to an end. Years later, she would try again, marrying Alan Griezmann in 1984. That union brought her a 3rd son, Samuel, and, for a time, the possibility of something steadier. But even that chapter, which lasted a decade, eventually dissolved in 1994, leaving behind another layer of experience that could not be easily simplified into success or failure. Threaded between these two marriages was a relationship the public believed it understood, but never truly did: her connection with Burt Reynolds. For 4 years, from the late 1970s into the early 1980s, they were everywhere. Captured by cameras, celebrated as one of Hollywood's most captivating couples. On screen, their chemistry felt effortless, almost inevitable, because it was grounded in something real. But beyond the lens, the dynamic was far more complicated. Reynolds, for all his charm and undeniable presence, carried his own unresolved pain. And when two people, shaped by deep, unspoken wounds, come together, what forms is not always healing. It is often friction. Sally has spoken about that relationship with a quiet honesty that resists simplification. She loved him, that much is clear. But she has also acknowledged that it was not a healthy space for her, that it echoed patterns she had spent a lifetime trying to outgrow. The need for approval, the instinct to accommodate, the subtle diminishing of self in the presence of someone stronger or louder. These were not new dynamics, but familiar ones, repeating themselves in a different form. And in that repetition lies one of the most difficult truths of all. Sometimes, what feels like love is also what keeps us bound to the very things we are still trying to escape. The reaching for approval, the shrinking of self in the presence of a dominant personality, the old learned accommodation of someone who needs something from you in a way that costs you more than you should have to pay. But Burt Reynolds died in 2018, the same year Sally published her memoir. She did not use his death as an occasion for public statement. She had already said in those pages what there was to say about what they were to each other. The grief, if she felt it, was the quiet kind, the kind that does not perform. 3 sons, 2 failed marriages, 1 relationship that burned bright and burned her, and running beneath all of it, never fully resolved, never fully quiet. The childhood she was still, even in her 50s and 60s, still sorting through, still trying to understand, still trying to place in some framework that would allow her to stop blaming herself for surviving it the way she did. Because that is what no one tells you about the children who are harmed in the ways Sally was harmed. The damage is not primarily in the memory of the event. The damage is in the conclusion the child draws about their own value. The lesson that gets installed without consent at the deepest level of the operating system that you are not worth protecting. That harm is something you absorb. That love is something you earn by disappearing into whatever shape the other person requires. Sally Field spent decades inside that lesson. She performed her way through it. She mother-thered through it. She loved through it. She accepted awards through it. Standing at podiums telling audiences that they liked her, they really liked her in a moment that the world received as charming. And that was in fact the raw, unguarded truth of a woman for whom approval had always felt like oxygen and its absence like slow suffocation. But she was not confessing insecurity in that moment. She was confessing decades. There is a particular kind of strength that looks from the outside like invincibility. It moves through rooms with quiet authority. It delivers lines that make grown men weep in darkened theaters. It accepts awards with grace and deflects scrutiny with humor, and shows up decade after decade in projects that lesser artists would have avoided, because the artist in question has never learned how to stop proving herself, has never fully believed that she has already proven enough. That is not invincibility. That is a woman running. And Sally Field ran for a very long time. The 1970s arrived and found her at a crossroads that the industry had designed with particular cruelty for women who refused to remain decorative. Gig was behind her. The Flying Nun was behind her. The cheerful, uncomplicated brightness that had made her famous was beginning to feel to the people who controlled the opportunities like the full perimeter of what she could offer. She was being managed out of seriousness before she had ever been given the chance to demonstrate it. Pigeonholed with the casual violence that the entertainment industry reserves for women whose value has been decided too early and too narrowly. She fought it, not loudly, not with the kind of public rebellion that generates headlines and then generates consequences. She fought it the way she had always fought, the hardest things from the inside, quietly, with an almost terrifying commitment to the work itself. She enrolled in the actor's studio. She studied with Lee Strasberg. She submitted herself to the most rigorous training available in American theater and film, not because she needed external validation of her talent, though the industry's skepticism had certainly earned its share of doubt, but because she understood instinctively that the only way through the ceiling above her was to become so undeniably, technically, irrefutably good that dismissal would require a level of dishonesty even Hollywood could not sustain. And then came Civil. In 1976, Sally Field took on one of the most demanding roles in the history of American television. A woman living with a condition that at the time had almost no cultural vocabulary and even less public understanding. Sybil Dorsett was not a character who could be played from the surface. She required something far more terrifying. Full surrender to psychological complexity, a full inhabitation of states that most actors would have approached from a careful, protective distance. Sally did not approach from a distance. She won the Emmy Award, both of them for Outstanding Lead Actress in what remains one of the most discussed performances in the medium's history. The industry that had spent a decade filing her under light comedy was forced publicly, and without the option of quiet revision, to reckon with what it had been underestimating. But it was what came 3 years later that would define her legacy in ways that still resonate. Norma Ray. The year was 1979. The director was Martin Ritt. The character was a cotton mill worker in a small southern town, a woman of limited formal education and unlimited moral courage, who stands up against conditions that the powerful have decided the powerless should simply accept. A woman who lifts a handwritten sign above her head in the middle of a factory floor, and in doing so stops time. To watch Sally Field in Norma Ray is to watch something that transcends performance and becomes, in the truest sense, witness. She is not playing a working-class woman. She is not illustrating one. She is occupying the full interior of a human being whose dignity has been underestimated by everyone around her. And she is doing it with the complete, unguarded presence of someone who knows from the inside exactly what it feels like to be underestimated, to be looked past, to be assigned a value by people who have never paused, long enough to actually see you. She won the Academy Award. She stood at that podium in 1980 and received it with a composure that belied everything the journey had cost. She thanked the people she was supposed to thank. She was gracious and warm, and precisely as generous in that moment as she had always been in every moment. The cameras were present, and she returned home to the private landscape of a life that the award did not simplify and the applause did not heal, because that is the part the industry never narrates. The part after the podium. The part where the woman who has just been told by her peers that she is the best in the world at what she does returns to an apartment or a house or a life in which the wound that drove her to that level of excellence is still exactly where she left it, undisturbed by the trophy, unimpressed by the reviews. Still there, they're still asking the same question it had always asked. Are you worth it? Not the performance, not the character. You. 5 years later, in 1984, she answered that question from a different stage. Places in the Heart. A Depression-era widow in Waxahee, Texas. A woman named Edna Spaulding who is left without warning and without preparation to hold together a farm, a family, and a life that a single moment of random violence has fundamentally unmade. A woman who has no reason to believe she can do what is required of her, and no choice but to do it anyway. The parallels were not accidental. They never were with Sally. The characters she chose, or perhaps more accurately, the characters that chose her, were consistently women operating at the outer limit of what a person can endure and still remain recognizably see themselves. Women who carry damage without being defined by it. Women who love imperfectly and fiercely. Women who survive not because they are exceptional in any abstract mythological sense, but because they refuse, in the very specific and unglamorous way of real human beings, to stop. She won her second Academy Award, and this time at the podium, something different happened. You like me. You really like me. The world laughed affectionately. The clip circulated for decades, held up, sometimes tenderly and sometimes unkindly, as the emblem of an endearing earnestness. An actress so nakedly hungry for approval that she said the quiet part out loud in front of the entire industry. What the laughter missed was the depth of what she was actually saying. This was not a woman who had momentarily forgotten her composure. This was a woman for whom the need to be liked, to be seen, to be valued, to be told explicitly that her presence in the room was wanted, was not a charming quirk, but a lifelong ache with very specific origins. The little girl, whose safety had depended on reading the emotional temperature of dangerous rooms. The teenager who had learned that warmth was a currency she could spend to purchase something resembling security. The young actress who had spent a decade being told in the polite language of professional dismissal that she was not quite enough. She was not performing gratitude in that moment. She was releasing 60 years of the opposite. The career that followed those two Oscars continued at a level that most actors would describe as a summit, and that Sally treated characteristically as simply the next portion of the work to be done. Steel Magnolia arrived in 1989 and gave her Melind Eaton, the role that a specific generation will name without hesitation as the one that broke them open. The scene in the cemetery, the grief that erupts not in the soft, photogenic way of cinematic mourning, but in the raw, almost violent way of actual loss, the kind that has no interest in being witnessed gracefully and cannot be contained within the frame of what is socially acceptable. It was not acting, it was excavation. And then, 5 years later, Forest Gump had a role that required almost none of the technical complexity of Norma Ray or Sybil. And that reached somehow an even wider audience, because what Sally brought to Mrs. Gump was not technique. It was something quieter and in some ways more difficult. Pure, uncomplicated maternal love. The absolute, unconditional no performance required conviction that a child is worthy of everything, of protection, of encouragement, of the full, fierce dedication of the person responsible for them. She played it from a place that had no distance in it. Life is like a box of chocolates. The line became a cultural touchstone. What it carried in her delivery was something the writers could not have fully anticipated. The weight of a woman who understood from the inside what it meant to have that kind of love withheld. Who knew the precise dimensions of its absence? Who could offer it on screen with such completeness because she had spent her entire life understanding what it meant to need it and not receive it? Throughout these decades of professional triumph, the private architecture of her life was being tested in ways that the camera never fully captured. Life after the collapse of her second marriage did not offer her rest. It demanded more of her than ever before. At 47, Sally Field found herself raising 3 sons, Peter, Eli, and Sam Griezmann. On her own, carrying the quiet exhaustion of a woman who had already given so much to the world, yet still had to find something deeper to give when the lights were off and no one was watching. Motherhood became the one place where she was not performing, not striving, not trying to prove her worth. It was where she could simply be, imperfect, present, and fiercely devoted in the ways that mattered most. Her sons were not just her responsibility, they were her grounding force, the steady center in a life that had often been shaped by instability. When she speaks about them, there is a depth of gratitude that goes beyond love, because what they gave her was something more profound. Evidence. Evidence that she could build what she herself had never been given, that she could create safety where there had once been none, that the patterns formed in the shadows of her childhood did not have to define what came next. That truth became even more visible in her relationship with her youngest son, Sam. As an openly gay man, he has spoken about the honesty and warmth that defined his journey of coming out, describing it not as a moment of fear, but as a conversation grounded in trust with his mother. Sally did not just accept him, she stood beside him, publicly and unapologetically, becoming a vocal advocate for the LGBTQ community. She spoke about him with pride, not as an exception, but as a reflection of what unconditional love is meant to be. In 2012, when she received the Ally for Equality Award, she made it clear that supporting her son was never a question. It was instinct. It was love, expressed without hesitation. In that bond, something remarkable is revealed. The closeness they share, the openness, the sense of safety that Sam himself has described. These are not accidental. They are the result of conscious choices, made again and again by a woman determined not to pass down what she once endured. Her children became living proof that love does not have to wound, that it can protect, affirm, and hold without breaking. And in that, perhaps more than in any performance or award, lies one of the most meaningful truths of her life. She did not become what hurt her. She became something else entirely. And then, on the 6th of November 2011, on her 65th birthday, her mother died. There is almost no way to write about that timing that does not feel like an overreach toward the dramatic. And yet it happened. The woman who had given Sally life and who had also, in the most foundational way, failed to protect it, left the world on the exact day Sally had entered it 65 years before. The grief was not simple. It could not be, because grief for a parent who has harmed you or failed to protect you from harm carries within it a complexity that clean mourning does not have to navigate. And you are grieving the person who was there. You are also grieving the person who should have been there and wasn't. You are grieving the love that existed alongside the failure. Because the love did exist, complicated and real and insufficient and profound all at once. Sally had spent years by that point in therapy. Years working through what her childhood had cost her, what it had built in her, what it had taken from her that she was still, even in her 60s, in the process of reclaiming. The death of her mother did not resolve any of that, but it changed the shape of it. It closed a door that had always, on some level, remained slightly open. The door through which a child waits, even in the body of an aging woman, for the acknowledgement that never quite arrives in the form you needed it to take. Margaret was gone, and with her went the last possibility of the conversation that perhaps neither of them had ever fully known how to have. Sally did not retreat, she wrote. 7 years of writing, 7 years of returning to the page and then leaving it, of finding the language and then losing it, of getting close enough to the truth to feel its heat and then stepping back because the heat was simply too much. 7 years of a process that her editor would later describe as one of the most committed and painful acts of literary courage she had witnessed in her professional life. In 2018, In Pieces arrived. It was received broadly as an act of bravery, a disclosure, a memoir about surviving childhood sexual abuse, about the complexity of loving a mother who failed you, and about the lifelong work of understanding how early damage shapes the architecture of adult life. The reviews were respectful. The interviews were conducted with care. What was perhaps underappreciated in the noise of the reception was the specific nature of the courage involved. Sally Field was 71 years old when that book was published. She had spent more than 6 decades carrying a truth that the world did not know. She had built an entire career, a legendary 2-Oscar industry-defining career, while holding this story in the part of herself that the cameras never reached. And she had then sat down in her late 60s and early 70s and written it out, not to perform bravery, not for the publicity cycle, but because the silence had finally cost more than the telling, because she was done protecting everyone else, and because she had earned at last the right to take up the full space of her own truth. The world received the book, but the cost of writing it, the 7 years of excavation, the reopening of wounds that had been managed but never fully closed, the specific grief of putting into permanent words what had been done to her by someone her mother had chosen and trusted. That cost remained hers alone, as it always had been. She spent 60 years making the world feel safe. The work of making herself feel the same had taken every year that remained. Time has not erased what her body has carried. It has only made it more honest. At 79, Sally Field begins each day in a body that holds memory in ways words never fully could. The osteoporosis diagnosed in 2005 did not disappear. It became something she learned to live alongside with quiet discipline. Careful movement, physical therapy, and the steady, uncelebrated rituals of maintenance have become part of her daily life. Because when a lifetime of strain settles into the bones, survival is no longer about resistance. It is about attention, about learning how to protect what was never fully protected before. The body, after all, does not forget. It records everything. And yet, The woman within that body has arrived somewhere her younger self might not recognize. Not peace, exactly, because peace suggests an absence of struggle, and struggle has always been part of her story. But something close to it, a quieter place, a form of acceptance shaped not by surrender, but by understanding. She lives in Los Angeles now, surrounded by a life that has grown beyond her. Her 3 sons, Peter, Eli, and Samuel, are adults, each carrying their own histories, their own complexities, shaped in part by a mother who gave everything she could, even while she herself was still learning how to heal. When she speaks of them, there is a softness that reveals something deeper than pride. Motherhood, for her, was never just something she offered. It was something that gave back. It became proof, repeated over years, that love did not have to wound, that the patterns she was born into did not have to define what she passed forward. And now, with the arrival of her grandchildren, there is a different rhythm to her presence, a stillness that once felt unreachable. The ability to sit in a room with someone new, someone untouched by complexity, and offer warmth without the hidden cost it once carried. In recent years, she has spoken about aging with a clarity that feels almost radical in its simplicity. She does not chase youth, does not reshape herself to meet expectations that were never built to hold truth. She does not hide the years. She allows them to exist, visible and unfiltered. Because at 79, what remains is not an attempt to resist time, but a willingness to be seen as she is, fully, without performance. The miles are visible. And she has arrived, it seems, at the decision that visibility is not the same as vulnerability, that allowing herself to be seen accurately is in fact the final form of the courage she has been practicing her entire life. Because that is what the arc of Sally's story ultimately describes. Not a trajectory from obscurity to fame, not a narrative of wounds overcome and legacy secured. Something more honest and more difficult than either of those framings. A lifelong education in the difference between being seen and being known, between performing survival and actually surviving, between the applause that fills a room and the quiet that remains when the room empties, and learning finally to find that quiet habitable rather than terrifying. She has said, and in the language of a woman who has earned the right to plain speech, that writing in pieces changed her, not in the way that people sometimes describe transformation, sudden, complete, the before and after divided by a clean line, but in the slower, more trustworthy way. The way that happens when you finally stop carrying something in the dark and bring it into a light you chose, on your own terms, at a moment you controlled. The weight does not disappear, but it shifts. It becomes somehow more yours. Less a thing being done to you, and more a thing you have claimed and named and placed deliberately in the record. The little girl in that California house was not able to choose any of it. The woman at 79 chose all of this. That distinction is not small. It is in fact everything. And so what remains when you have stripped away the awards and the credits and the decades of performances that made generations of strangers feel understood? What is the actual legacy of Sally Field? Not the cultural artifact, but the human being. It is this: a woman who was handed damage at an age when she had no tools to refuse it, and who spent the entirety of the life that followed deciding over and over, in ways large and invisible, and everything in between, that the damage would not be the last word, who built a career from the raw material of her own interior, who loved her children with the fierce, deliberate intention of someone who knew exactly what the absence of that love produced, who sat down in her 70s and wrote the truth, not for applause, not for the publicity cycle, and not for the clean resolution that memoirs are sometimes mistaken for providing, but because silence in the end had cost more than she was willing to keep paying. She spent 60 years making the world feel safe, and then at last she turned that same attention, careful, fierce, unflinching, toward herself. That is not a small thing. In a culture that asks women, and particularly women who have been harmed, to absorb quietly and perform gracefully and never demand more space than they have been assigned, choosing to tell the full truth of your own life is an act of profound and lasting courage. It does not require a podium. It does not require an audience. It requires only the willingness to believe, after everything, that your story, the real one, not the curated one, is worth the telling. Sally Field believed it at 79, so she still does. As this story reaches its closing moment, the question no longer belongs to the past. It belongs to you. What does it say to you that a woman could carry a wound this deep for more than 60 years and still shape it into something so meaningful, so enduring, so quietly powerful? Take a moment to share your thoughts below, because stories like this only truly matter when they continue beyond the telling, when they find the person who needed to hear them at exactly the right time. If Sally Field's journey has stirred something within you, pass it forward to someone who may be carrying their own unseen weight. And subscribe so the next story arrives when you need it most. Because behind every legend, beyond the applause and recognition, there is a human being who simply chose to keep going. And in the end, that quiet decision, the refusal to stop, may be the most lasting legacy of all.